I'm Katy Bass. I'm the research director at the Knight Institute. Thank you all for spending your day with us, and thanks to those of you who have been watching the live stream online as well. Our last panel today is on protecting the right to receive ideas from abroad. So a number of the panel discussions today have referenced the listener's rights, so the rights to receive information from others, in this case from abroad. And we're going to dig in on that. We're going to hear more about the history of those rights, some of the foundational cases that sort of form those concepts. Because as others have pointed out, listeners' rights are both very important for some of the battles that we are having these days over forms of information, and they're also actually quite well grounded in the case law, even though they don't often feature in mainstream discussions of the First Amendment, which are often framed as the right of a speaker to speak. So we'll hear a little more about the listener side of the equation, and we'll talk about how the US government has viewed foreign speech in the past, how it should view that speech. And we'll be looking both at the Cold War context that we're going to hear about in a few different papers, as well as current debates over things like the TikTok ban and how we should respond to disinformation campaigns run by foreign actors. And finally, we'll also be talking about the particular value that foreign speech can have in terms of enriching US public discourse and debate and facilitating our ability to self-govern. I have a really great lineup here to discuss this with us. So starting from farthest away, Chinmayi Arun is a research scholar and the executive director of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Next to her is Nick Robinson, who is a senior legal advisor at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, where he manages the US program. Next to him is Sam Lebovic, who is a historian of US politics, culture, civil liberties, and foreign relations, and a former senior visiting research scholar at the Knight Institute. And then next to me is my colleague, George Wang, who is a staff attorney at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for writing papers. We have 3 great papers that were written for this symposium that we'll be discussing and connecting to the broader context we've been discussing today. I'm going to begin by asking George to briefly present his paper, Listeners' Rights in the Time of Propaganda, the story of Lamont versus Postmaster General, which is an in-depth exploration of the history of that case, whose significance George will explain for us. And just to brag a little bit on George's behalf, George did some really fantastic archival research for this piece. He is probably now the world's leading expert on the archives of Corliss Lamont, who is the plaintiff. So George, tell us about Lamont.
Thank you, Katy, and thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon. So my paper, as Katy mentioned, tells the story of Lamont versus Postmaster General, which has been mentioned a few times at various panels already during the day. Lamont is this fascinating case from the 60s, decided during the height of the Cold War, which invalidated a federal law barring Americans from receiving communist political propaganda from abroad unless they requested that it be delivered. The story of Lamont is one of the vital importance of listeners in the constellation of interests safeguarded by the First Amendment. It firmly established for the first time that the First Amendment protects the right of the public to receive information and ideas from abroad, even when the government deems that material subversive and un-American. Incidentally, Lamont was also the very first time the Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress on First Amendment grounds. So with how I'm speaking about Lamont right now, you might imagine that this is a landmark case that is the cornerstone of our First Amendment doctrine. Yet for all of its apparent significance, Lamont is largely an overlooked and underappreciated precedent. Although the Supreme Court has, at this point, recognized the rights of listeners as important to the First Amendment repeatedly, Lamont itself has not spawned a robust right to hear and know from foreign sources, as Sam may well talk about in a moment. So the goal of my paper is not just to tell the gripping tale of how the Lamont case came to be, but to give Lamont the recognition it deserves as one of the court's most important First Amendment decisions. So I want to spend the rest of my opening remarks just giving a brief history of Lamont, and hopefully over the course of our panel discussion kind of talk about a couple of the other pieces of my paper as well. But let's just jump right into it. So Lamont involved the challenge to Section 305 of the Postal Service and Federal Employees Salary Act of 1962. The law directed the Postmaster General to intercept and detain foreign mail that was determined by the government to be communist political propaganda. It provided that the intended recipients of the mail would be notified of such matter had been received, but the mail would only be delivered upon the addressee's request. So this is where our protagonist, Dr. Corliss Lamont, enters the picture. One late July day in 1963, Lamont receives a notice in the mail from the post office informing him that it had intercepted and detained a copy of the Peking Review number 12 that had been addressed to the small publishing company that he ran. The notice was sent pursuant to Section 305, and it informed Lamont that the magazine, which was an English language periodical published by the Chinese government, was communist political propaganda. And it gave Lamont a choice. He could return an included reply card indicating that he desired delivery of that magazine, or the magazine would be destroyed. So rather than do any of these things, Lamont decides to bring suit instead and challenge Section 305 as unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So let me say a few words about Lamont the man before diving into Lamont the case. Lamont is really a fascinating figure. He was a philosopher and professor, born to a prominent New York banker and educated at Phillips Exeter and Harvard. So in short, he was, a kind of privileged rich guy. And there's very little about Lamont's background that would suggest that he would become this kind of, patron saint for radical causes. But that's what he did. He was a longtime director of the ACLU and then a longtime leader of the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. And by the time he had filed this lawsuit against the Postmaster General, Lamont had already tangled with the State Department, the FBI, which Lamont called the Federal Bureau of Idiots, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and even Senator Joseph McCarthy. And he did all of this while summering in Maine. Okay, so Lamont files suit, and the case eventually reaches the Supreme Court. And it's worth pausing here to underscore what was so unique about the circumstances giving rise to Lamont's case. Lamont's complaint did not allege that the government had done anything to prevent him from writing or otherwise expressing his views, and nothing about Section 305, the law, purported to prevent Lamont from saying anything he wished. Rather, the only speakers whose activities were subject to the law were foreign entities, for instance, the Chinese agency that published the Peking Review. And as we discussed this morning, there are some serious questions about whether these speakers from abroad even possess First Amendment rights to assert. So instead, what remained for the court to consider was the fairly novel contention that the First Amendment protected Lamont's right to receive information independent of any speaker's right to speak. The court hears the case on April 26, 1965, and a little less than a month later issues its opinion, and it's unanimous. All the justices who participated in the decision agreed that Section 305 was unconstitutional. So Justice Douglas was assigned to write for the court, and Justice Douglas's majority opinion was, equal parts, I would say, revelatory as well as cryptic. Even as his opinion engaged in these really fundamental ideas about who and what the First Amendment protects, it was also vague and pretty difficult to parse. So, for instance, Douglas wrote that the law reflected an impermissible attempt by the government to control the flow of ideas to the public that was at war with the uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate and discussion that are contemplated by the First Amendment. But he did very little to explain the nature of the underlying interest at stake, or to make any philosophical or doctrinal case for why and how the First Amendment protects the rights of listeners. Justice Brennan did a little bit better in a concurring opinion. Brennan's concurrence more explicitly drew out the logic that was missing from Douglas's majority. He explained that the key question before the court was the scope of addressees' right to receive information and ideas from abroad. Although he acknowledged that the First Amendment contains no specific guarantee of access to publications, Brennan reasoned that the right to receive publications was nonetheless a, quote, fundamental right. He wrote that the dissemination of ideas can accomplish nothing if otherwise willing addressees are not free to receive and consider them. In other words, it would be a barren marketplace of ideas that had only sellers and no buyers. Thus, even if foreign speakers lacked any right to speak under the First Amendment, the American public had a right to listen to and consider what these speakers had to say. I'll say, despite the status of Brennan's opinion as a concurrence, it's actually not at all clear that Douglas disagreed with Brennan. In a memo from Douglas to Brennan prior to the publication of the opinion, Douglas professed that he liked Brennan's opinion very much and asked whether there's anything in his own opinion that stands in the way of Brennan joining it, noting that he would be very happy to circulate the necessary revision in order to accommodate Brennan's needs. Unfortunately, there was no recorded response from Brennan, and Douglas's opinion went to the printer largely unchanged from its original formulation. So, despite the fact that Douglas's language in Lamont is maybe a little muddy, the principle at the heart of the decision is actually quite clear. The court's ruling powerfully recognized, in a time of deep uncertainty and distrust, that preserving the free flow of ideas across borders is vital to maintaining a robust democracy. And Lamont stands for this idea that the First Amendment does not just protect the rights of speakers to speak, but also the rights of the public to listen and to learn about the world. And it turns out that nugget of truth is as important now in the digital age as it was during the Cold War. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, George. So I want to follow up on something that you just said, which is the government may not interfere with the free flow of ideas, because this was striking to me in their decision and in this paper. Because the government, one of their arguments was, well, we're not preventing people from receiving this information. They just have to tell us that they want it. And that's not satisfactory to the court. Can you talk a little bit about that, both the ways the government tried to evade this sort of constitutional review, but then also why the court wasn't satisfied by their arguments?
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the development of the case. So, one thing to know about the law, this 1962 law, was actually, it was an attempt to legislatively revive this practice that began in the 50s of mail interception on an administrative basis. And that program was ended by President Kennedy when he took office in 61. And so it was really this attempt to bring it back. And all through that time that this administrative program was running, there were attempts to challenge it on First Amendment grounds. But what the government did in each of these cases was to, once a lawsuit was filed, the government would get in touch and say, okay, well, we'll just send you your mail from now on. So now the case is moot, and please dismiss the case. And no challenge really successfully got there. And that happened in Lamont's case as well. He files suit. His lawyer gets this letter that's like, okay, well, we're going to add your information to this list, and we're going to send along your information from now on. So please voluntarily dismiss the case, because obviously it's moot, right? But Lamont's lawyer, Leonard Boudin, a wonderful, famous leftist lawyer, says, he decides to amend the complaint to add this idea that, the very keeping of this list also is a burden on Lamont's right. This ultimately, by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, actually the post office decides to change policy again. It sees the First Amendment weakness of this keeping of lists, a keeping of lists of people who want communist propaganda. They see that it's vulnerable under the First Amendment, and so they change policy again and say, okay, we're not going to keep the lists anymore. And so really there were all of these ways that they were trying to dodge it. And the main thing that the court looks at is, it kind of doesn't matter what the mechanism is. The important thing is that it's a burden on these individuals' rights to receive information that they want, information that they need to be democratically engaged citizens.
Great, so one more question for you, and then I'm gonna bring Sam in. You noted that this case hasn't necessarily gotten the attention from the courts or from the public that you would expect it to merit. You would think that it's a really foundational cornerstone of First Amendment law, but as you note, it is not heavily cited in future court cases, and it's not necessarily a big part of the public conversation either. Why do you think that is, and what do you think might change if it did have a more significant place?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, and I think there are a couple of reasons. One of them is, as I mentioned before, Justice Douglas's majority opinion, while I think is really great on principle and right, is somewhat vague and confusing, and as I said, doesn't really provide that theoretical kind of heft to why it's important to protect the rights of listeners. I think another reason is, this case has been mentioned before, but the case of Kleindienst versus Mandel, which, really relied on the logic in Lamont, but in Kleindienst, the government decides that the plenary power doctrine, the government's plenary power over immigration, overrides even these kind of free speech concerns. So I think those two things eroded the value of Lamont. And I think that the last thing is that, the logic of Lamont really found the most purchase in kind of the strangest place, which is actually the rights of corporations, the First Amendment rights of corporations. So there are the cases that establish the commercial speech doctrine, the case of First National Bank versus Bellotti, they rely on this logic of, it's not necessarily the corporation's speaking rights that are at issue, but rather the rights of the American public to hear things about, prescription drug prices or other information. And so this logic of Lamont about the importance of information to listeners kind of gets subsumed into these, kind of corporate First Amendment rights cases, and I think all of that sort of muddies the water with Lamont. But I think Lamont, a revitalized Lamont, is, as I said before, just as important now as it was during the Cold War, because if you think about what it means to be a citizen, an engaged citizen of the US and of the world, it means hearing a diversity of viewpoints, understanding what's going on in the world, and using that to inform your own advocacy and your own discussion. And it's really important to our system of free expression and really our democracy to value those rights of listeners.
Thank you. Sam, your paper also looks at the Cold War context, and it discusses Lamont, but it also discusses a number of other fights that were being had at the same time over similar concepts and ideas. The way you put it is, do Americans have a right to know about the world? So can you talk to us about your paper?
Sure. Thanks all. Thanks for having me. In the early Cold War, there's actually just a kind of tapestry of border censorship policies in place in the United States. Many of them don't sort of bear the label of censorship policies, but that's what they are. George has nicely talked about some of the postal regulations. Some of those are these kind of obscure regulatory, made-up laws, really, sort of stitching together Foreign Agent Registration Act and the Espionage Act to say that you can't receive propaganda from a communist country. But there are also currency control regulations to sort of prevent you from sending American currency to North Korea or Vietnam that mean you can't bring information in without a license. There are also three other sorts of border censorship policies in place that I think are really important. The first is there are a whole host of passport regulations in place in the early Cold War, which basically mean that the passport division can deny an American citizen a passport if they think that that person's travel will not be in the best interests of the United States. At the time, it's illegal to leave the country without a passport, and so that means that actually one woman is in charge of the passport division office from 1927 until 1955. She's kind of like a second J. Edgar Hoover type figure, a real conservative. She boasts, one of the things I believe in is denying passports to communists. And so this means that people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, a host of other radicals are grounded, kind of imprisoned in the continental United States in the early Cold War. So you can't travel overseas if you're subject to one of these censorship practices. Foreigners who want to enter are also subject to visa denial on ideological grounds. That's what happens to Mandel. I think it's important here, there's a long and sort of celebrated list of individual luminaries who were denied entry to the United States during the Cold War. Charlie Chaplin, Pablo Neruda, Hortensia Allende, 350 Hiroshima survivors who want to come to New York to discuss nuclear disarmament in the 1980s, and the list goes on and on. But even more important, there are thousands of people who are denied visas because they're a member of a communist party or a suspected communist party. There's a process in the law that allows you to apply for a waiver, that the Attorney General can give you a waiver to come into the country even though you're formally barred. And what that turns into is really a licensing system. and that has direct First Amendment implications, particularly for journalists working for international communist newspapers who want to come to the United States. They get a visa that says you can come in, but there are conditions attached. There's a guy that I look at, a French journalist for a communist newspaper, and one of the conditions is that while he's in the United States reporting on the United Nations meetings, he won't report anything that's, quote, un-American, is one of the sort of conditions attached to his entry visa. So there's these travel documents to come in and out of the country, and then the final form of travel restriction are what's called area restrictions, and this is rather than denying an individual a right to a travel document, the US government declares entire parts of the world sort of off limits to United States citizens writ large, and this is North Vietnam, North Korea, the Soviet bloc in the early 1950s, some of the most consequential fronts of the early Cold War. All of these practices together, I think, have serious impacts on the quality of the US public sphere and debate in the United States. They obviously are censorship mechanisms targeted at the left and have real implications for domestic civil liberties, rights of association. They also, I think, though, should be seen not just as sort of pretextual technocratic reasons to go after the left and punish them. I think they're also an effort to monopolize foreign relations on behalf of the national security branches of the US government. And one of the things I think is helpful from the historian's point of view to think about in today's discussion is that, you know, information has tended to flow across territorial borders throughout history. The development of the national border as a kind of key filtering mechanism to prevent information coming in and out is a mid-20th century invention. And in the US, it's particularly tight in the early Cold War for a variety of reasons that have to do with the law, but also have to do with the national consolidation of media companies, the closing of the US border to immigration in 1924, which is still ongoing until 1965. And so what we often think of as the kind of rise of America to world power, the kind of US becoming a global force in the 1950s, can also be seen as an era of Americans really becoming insulated in their public sphere at home, where they have less access to information from overseas for a variety of reasons. And I think this has real consequences for American foreign policy. But also thinking back to sort of Evelyn's comments earlier about some of the hydraulics at play, it's also worth thinking about the fact that the rise of the First Amendment as a judicially enforced kind of glorified right of free expression comes at the moment when there's actually less foreign ideas coming into the United States writ large, which means these particular kind of choke points around passports and visas and area restrictions take on outsized significance.
Thanks, Sam. So to start off, this right to know about the world that you sketch out in your paper, do you see that as synonymous with listeners' rights, or is it a related right? How would you describe the scope of it?
Sure. So the idea of a right to know about the world is partly something that I came up with as a way of capturing a host of the civil liberties protests against this array of border censorship protests. But it's also something that one of the key activists in my story, a radical journalist by the name of William Worthy, who is one of the sort of forgotten figures of US 20th century politics, I think. He argues at one point that what defines his work, and he gets his passport stripped for traveling to Hungary and China without a passport. He goes to Cuba without a passport, and there's a series of legal cases that come out of that. He brings classified documents home from Iran in the early 80s at a point when travel to Iran is regulated. And he's asked, why does he keep sort of getting himself in legal trouble to do foreign journalism? And he says, I believe the American people have a right to know what's being done in the world in their name. So that's his kind of framework for it. So I don't think it's actually listeners' rights straightforwardly, particularly because one of the things I develop in the paper is when we look at Lamont and we think about the way that the courts have, in reaction to this series of lawsuits and series of actions of civil disobedience pushing at the borders of these that's an unintended pun, pushing at the kind of sutures between these border censorship practices. The courts begin to recognize certain types of rights that are impinged upon by censorship of passports and visas, but they never come out and really make a claim that citizens have a right to travel overseas to gather information, that citizens have a right to receive information from abroad. They break it down into a host of kind of ancillary rights or subsidiary rights, a Fifth Amendment right to travel, as a kind of right of self-fulfillment. Sometimes they talk about a right to receive information in the Lamont case, but it's really a very passive vision of citizenship, that you're just going to sit at home and consume the documents that you want, and that your right to buy things can't be interfered with. And this right to know about the world, I think, is a much more active vision of citizenship. It's a right to travel, to information, and then to use that information to advocate at home and communicate at home. And it sees the central First Amendment right not just as a passive right of listening, but as an active right of communication that involves both sort of inputs and then further outputs. And I think that would be a more productive way to imagine the right. It would open up more possibilities for challenging bad practices at the border.
Great, thank you. One thing that I wondered as I was reading this paper is sort of the right to travel in the digital age, and sort of, is there a way to tease out, Sam or Georgia, really anyone, the importance of physically being somewhere, or of allowing a speaker to enter the US physically in an era when, in theory, you could Zoom with anyone anywhere around the world. You can see a great deal of the world without leaving home in terms of pictures and recordings and things. But it does seem to me like there's something very important about the physical ability to move in space. So how might we try to articulate that in this digital era?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just about the difference between a conversation and the right to report, which the right to report and actually go overseas and observe what you want to observe, to move in the spaces you want to move in, to sort of more easily identify Potemkin village type scenarios, is an important right. I think Mandel, there's some discussion actually, even in the 70s, where one of the arguments that's raised in that case is, why do you need to bring this Marxist into the country? Can't you just read his writing or like bring him in on a telephone? I mean, this is actually Paul Robeson in the 50s has to perform via telephone to sort of international solidarity groups because he's not allowed to leave the country. And the court, I think, says that even the court, in turning down the First Amendment right to bring Mandela into the country, says we do acknowledge that there is a benefit to being in person in dialogue that doesn't exist just through communication. So, I mean, I think there's a host of things that would be lost. I do think that there has been a change from the early Cold War, that, the US in the 50s and 60s, speaking as a historian, is a remarkably, surprisingly insular and closed culture. It's much more open now, so that the particular valence of, more selective filters and more selective acts of censorship is maybe less important. But I think there's a value added.
Thank you. Nick, you have a lot of experience working on an issue that's closely related to this, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, which has been mentioned earlier today as well. You've written extensively about it. You also deal with it in your work for ICNL. Can you give us a brief tour? What is FARA and what First Amendment rights are implicated by it?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know, I work at ICNL, and we work in the US and around the world to create a protective legal environment for activists, for nonprofits, for social movements, and I manage the US program. And in recent years, we've seen an increasingly significant impact on nonprofits with the Foreign Agent Registration Act and an increasing chilling effect. I started working on comprehensive FARA reform maybe about 7 years ago. And at that time, I'd say most nonprofits just really didn't know what FARA was. And then when it started impacting the nonprofit community, it was generally more like large international environmental groups. But in the last year or two, I'm talking regularly to grassroots activists, to funders, to nonprofits from a really kind of diverse range of groups who are being impacted by this act, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And I think to understand why, a little bit of background is helpful. So, this is also a World War II era statute that was designed to target Nazi propaganda. It was billed as a transparency statute. So essentially, if you engage in certain covered activities, including very broadly defined political activities on behalf of a foreign principal, you need to register with the US government. But we shouldn't kid ourselves, right? This is a criminal statute, has notoriously broad and vague provisions about who needs to register, and it was used in a discretionary manner in the war to shut down Nazi propaganda. And it did that through stigmatization, red tape, there's a really kind of burdensome reporting requirements, investigation and prosecution. And at the time, the act was justified, I think, on this kind of Walter Lippmann notion of the dangers of propaganda. And I would say, this is kind of the strongest justification you hear for acts like FARA in the US and in other countries, which is this kind of self-governance one that we've been hearing today, that there's these outside actors that are trying to undermine our democracy. We need the government to step in and protect the US public and have interventions so that the public can navigate this. But I'd argue that, when you look at FARA in its totality, it's really kind of undermined the self-governance we need and the civil society we need to have self-governance. And we see this really early, actually, in the Act's history. So during the McCarthy era, FARA was used to prosecute W.E.B. Du Bois for circulating an anti-nuclear war petition at the request of a French nonprofit. He was ultimately acquitted. Question whether he should have been, actually, under the text of the act and how broad it is. But his reputation never recovered in his lifetime. After that, the act went into a period of kind of hibernation, where it was mostly used to go after kind of lobbying by foreign governments, and even then most people think that it wasn't enforced very strongly. And then 2016 happens, right? And we have a whole new era of FARA. And there's these concerns about Russian and Chinese interference in the election. And the Justice Department's looking around for tools to go after foreign interference, and FARA becomes one of the primary tools. So it's used to go after RTTV, Russian and Chinese media outlets, to prosecute key members of Trump's inner circle on lobbying for foreign governments. It's been used to go after Russian disinformation campaigns and a lot more. But it also emerges in a much more kind of politicized environment, right? And so we see a lot of confusion across civil society, right, about how this act might be used against them. So right now, there are multiple congressional investigations against nonprofits for violation of FARA. Particularly targeted are environmental groups and pro-Palestinian groups, but there's others as well. You get these confusing enforcement actions out of the Justice Department, so they issue these advisory opinions. I'll just kind of name two to give you a sense of how they're viewing the act. So for example, they told a church in Pennsylvania that they needed to register in the act under FARA because foreign congregants were coming in from France. They had requested that they print out signs for a March for Life rally, and they said that's registrable activity under the act, right? They've also said that if you're receiving foreign funding as a nonprofit, they have a very confusing three-part test that I don't think anybody understands about whether you need to register under the act or not. And so as a result, the nonprofit community is scrambling to really understand how to navigate this act. And so I'll leave it at that, just on that part of the question, but it's having this kind of chilling effect that we're seeing play out, and I can add many more examples that are happening right now.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I'd like to hear more about, you've mentioned in some of your writing the impact that this has on the right to association, and I think it's interesting to dig in on that because often when we're talking about the First Amendment, there's a tendency to shove everything into the free speech bucket, but associational rights are also very important and distinct. So can you talk a little bit about how those are implicated here?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is important also when you're kind of like thinking about reform, and I can go into kind of what we might want to think about in this space going forward and how other countries have adopted as well. And when we've talked about reform and think about how do you think about FARA or similar acts in other countries, we think about a rights-based approach. And very much this is, being able to hear information from the rest of the world. So a right to information from abroad, that's really important. But it's also the right to partner with people abroad, right? It's the right to act in coordination with people abroad. It's the right to exchange resources, including financial resources, with people abroad, right? And I think sometimes the way that speech rights get played out, it's a very kind of thin sense of our political culture, where I think associational rights and these cross-border associational rights, I think, are really important to understand. And even in that, though, I would kind of flag this, and this case came up earlier, that even when the rights are properly identified, right, they still need to be weighed appropriately by the courts. And we've seen this, for example, with Ms. V. Keen, right, which was a case about Farah that was mentioned earlier today, where the court, in a divided 5-3 decision, said at the time there was a requirement, there's a, to put on all covered materials that it's quote unquote propaganda, right? So a very kind of stigmatizing label. And that has to go out on all such covered material. And the court, I think quite implausibly, said that's not chilling, right? That's not a burden on speech. And you see, so not being able to kind of take into account what actually is a burden. And I think other courts in other parts of the world have had problems with this, but the European courts have done it much better. And I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Great, thank you. Chinmayi, your paper brings these debates into a more current context. It's called Losing TikTok. Do you want to present that for us, please?
Yeah, I just, thank you. So parts of what I'm going to say almost pull threads from what speakers have said through the day, and I've been delighted to hear it and to be educated by it. So there are two elements to my paper. The first is basically about the Chinese apps and the alarms raised about them. I called it accessing Ernie Bot's avatar initially, and then I realized that not everyone knows about Baidu's little chatbot, and I felt like losing TikTok is more contemporary. I'm going to keep the part about the Chinese app alarm short because I think that many people have discussed it today. And the second thing that I'm trying to do with the paper is basically draw on the idea of listeners' rights. I love Right to Know the World. I will cite you. Mine is the digital version of it, where I'm saying that that the way these apps are constructed, it's very rare for anyone to be a passive listener. If you're on TikTok or if you're on a social media app, you're liking things, you're choosing to read or watch one thing for longer than another. And often you're choosing to share and remake things, which means that the passive listener of the 60s is now potentially an end user or some version of someone trying to know the world digitally, which doesn't substitute for what Sam was trying to say. And so that's kind of the positive agenda of my paper. And so very quickly, I just wanted to go over, if anyone's interested in the TikTok ban, Anupam Chandar has written 2 marvelous papers, one solo authored and one with Paul Schwartz, that traces how it happened from former President Trump's initial choosing to ban it right up to the foreign adversaries. I'm also very sleep deprived currently, so I hope you'll forgive my poor choice of words now and then. And so the legislation that the Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, which is what TikTok is arguing against right now. The 2 concerns which I think have come up today have been data collection and manipulation. And I agree 100% with Evelyn. I am also a foreigner, but also someone that studies social media platforms. It is not clear to me why regulating these 2 things by targeting Chinese apps in particular is a better way to do it than to regulate all apps that engage in this. I, in fact, before moving on to this, want to say that it is potentially detrimental because creating the possibility for the executive to remove the Chinese apps from the American information ecosystem leaves the ecosystem in the hands of 2 or 3 companies, and that creates a very different kind of problem of public discourse. And so that's worth considering and weighing against the problem of manipulation and considering whether people are actually going to start believing things that they see on TikTok about Hong Kong, or whether they'll see them but it won't resonate with them because they are in this context watching American news, getting information from other sources. So that's me briefly about the TikTok ban. Moving on to the question of the listener, I'm very grateful to be a part of this symposium and a part of this panel in particular as I think through what Lamont means online. And I'm borrowing here partly from Jack Balkin's theory of what cultural democracy means. which is that there is the right to access information, and several scholars like Robert Post have suggested that there is a political element to this information that is important for Americans as citizens. But as Catherine so powerfully illustrated in her lunchtime talk today with her cute cat example, it's actually very difficult to separate cultural content from political content, and the way in which people mix the two and grow from them and get values from them are intermingled to a degree to which it's not possible to say that political speech is political speech and cultural speech is cultural speech. And so I am currently playing with this idea for my paper for the symposium, where I'm also thinking through what that means online. And so the example that I started thinking through, and I'll welcome anything that you have to add to it, is the Korean band BTS, which this generation that uses TikTok is also very into BTS. If you have any friends under 30, nephews or nieces, you know this band. It was interesting to me because I was looking up BTS and just to check what their TikTok presence was, and I discovered that when Black Lives Matter was raging, BTS felt that it resonated with their values. And it's interesting because BTS Army, which is what their fans are called, they love BTS not just for the music, but also for their values, which are anti-bullying and anti-discrimination. And so BTS gave $1 million to Black Lives Matters, encouraging the BTS Army in the US to raise $1 million for Black Lives Matters. And that is political, but it came from a group that was formed for cultural reasons. And it is a foreign group that stands for certain values, and these are values that American citizens may choose as their own, and values that may matter over here. I felt like it was a really powerful example of the way in which the younger generation forms associations and develops as individuals and also as collectives. Sam, I love that part of your paper where you flagged that listeners' rights have unfortunately been developed entirely as individual rights, and there is actually a collective element to them that is really powerful. And I think that that collective element is really big if you think about how online discourse works and how people under 30 engage with each other, often primarily on online platforms, but often forming social groups and alliances in ways that weren't possible earlier, but are possible for all the young people of the world. And it seems a great shame to me to take that away from young Americans. That's it from me.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit about a distinction you draw in the paper that you mentioned briefly here, but between understanding people as listeners versus understanding them as end users. If you could talk a little bit more about what that distinction is and what implications you think it has for the way we look at First Amendment rights of online people.
Thank you. So understanding them as end users recognizes that they are not passive consumers of content, and even if you, so in TikTok particular, which I'll confess I'm not on, and so I think the best I know of TikTok is things that I've been shown, but also Meta has a competitor called Instagram Reels, which is similar, and I've used that. Even if all you were doing, if you committed to not liking or sharing or reposting a single video, and most people don't engage that way, you would still be training the algorithm. You would be doing something merely by the watching of something because the algorithm learns you. And I think that I'm not even the demographic of young, I'm not quite young enough to be a classic TikTok user, but even I train the algorithm a little bit to show me things I wanted to show me. And that is minimal. The way the younger generation uses this is to signal, to find friends, to pick up a little song from one place, to combine it with a little video from a different place, to add commentary. And several of my former students are online. They do it to constantly signal things that they believe in, groups that they're a part of. And I think that that is the modern listener. They're not receiving the Peking Review and reading it and then hoping that they'll write a thing about it and it'll get published in a journal maybe next year. They're taking 3 seconds and they're making it their own. And in the process, they're changing maybe a little bit who they are. They're maybe becoming a part of a new circle, and maybe they're transmitting a value system or asking a question that's useful for someone else to consider.
I appreciated that framing as well because it evokes the idea of a constant ongoing conversation or dialogue, which is closer to the way we think about public discourse than just a listener, one-way listener relationship. So going back to something you said about distinctions or the inability really to distinguish between cultural content and political content, I'm just wondering, Sam or George or really anyone, are there any examples we can look to of the way courts or governments have considered this in the past? Like, there is this concept of core political speech that the courts are purportedly very concerned with. But in terms of cultural exchange and its value, do we know very much about the way the law has looked at this?
Well, I think there has been a long recognition in law that, despite the fact that we often refer to it as quote unquote core political speech, that, the arc of the law has gone more in the direction that Chinmayi has suggested, that what is political, what does political mean in a democracy, right? If a democracy is a government of people, then political is all the things that make us as people, and that means talking about the election, but it also means talking about pop culture and what's in magazines and what's on social media and all of that. And I think there's a broad recognition, maybe not in the language of court doctrine, but I think in the principles that are represented by the First Amendment, that political really does encompass this cultural, and that all the things that make us make meaning for us as citizens are more than just kind of how we vote and the things that contribute to our voting.
Anyone else?
I mean, it's maybe slightly tangential. I mean, I sort of two slightly tangential points, I guess. The first would be, it does feel like starting in about the 1930s, there's a real focus on cultural politics and the sort of the meaning-making of culture as a central front of sort of democratic politics, and struggles over things like the music and the movies and the political symbolism that's tied in some central way to, I think, a project of national consolidation, that there is an American culture, and it, that then breaks down in the 70s with a more sort of globalized culture. One of the key things that the New Left was active around was trying to kind of globalize the American imaginary and reconnect with sort of global decolonization movements and think more expansively about world citizenship, not just in politics, but in sort of the whole range of life. The other question that I hear you asking is, like, would there be any benefit in trying to distinguish between sort of more core First Amendment activity and these sort of more peripheral ones? And that came up in my paper in a place that I thought was interesting to think through, which was one of the reasons that courts are dismissive of claims of, say, a right to travel is because the court doesn't want to create a hierarchy of sort of First Amendment actors and say some people get the right to travel but other people don't. And that would mean that if you want to say you have a right to travel, then it's impossible to regulate in the field at all, because anyone who wants to go on a holiday to Cuba will then just go on a holiday to Cuba, and you can no longer say it might not be good for Americans to go to. Whether or not you believe there's a risk to going to Cuba or whatnot, if a government decides they want to regulate, if you're going to say all travel is equal and it all has First Amendment implications, well, then you're not going to be able to regulate at all. And actually, the case upholding the area restrictions on Cuba is a 1965 case, and Earl Warren in the majority says, we need to be able to do these kind of regulations, and they do interfere with the free flow of information. But if that was enough to strike down a government regulation as unconstitutional, well, then every type of government regulation could decrease data flow in some sense, and you'd have no governance left. And given what's happened over the last 40 years, that's not a bad reading of the kind of weaponization of the First Amendment before it's even happened. My argument, though, is that in all of these travel cases, there are in practice carve-outs where the government will say, we're not going to let you travel to communist China, but we will let journalists going for kind of journalistic activity travel. And they've had a pretty political definition of what journalist activity is, and that it would be helpful to know more about how those classifications have worked, but they have existed. And so while there's a lot of anxiety in First Amendment law about saying we're going to protect journalism and political activity and not other types of speech activity, in practice, in these kind of border cases, it's been happening. And I don't know whether it's been a good thing or a bad thing, but we shouldn't pretend like it hasn't been happening already.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with this in the context of FARA, because it's interesting, FARA directly addresses this, where the Act makes an exemption for bona fide religious, scholastic, academic, and fine arts activities. And it's interesting, what is bona fide? The Justice Department has interpreted this to mean non-political, right? So question, what is non-political art? What is non-political academic activity, right? And actually, I think groups, including probably those here at Columbia, are now paying more attention to this because there's been accusations of FARA violations of student groups on campuses. And the Act is impossibly broad. I should really make this clear, right? So a foreign principle under the Act makes no distinction between the government of Saudi Arabia and your grandmother in Canada. Treats both the same, right? Agency relationship, when are you acting as an agent? It's not just direction and control. It's if you're acting at the request, right? That's what the Du Bois example was. That was the printing of the sign at the request of a foreigner, right? Justice Department has expanded that recently and said it's if you're acting in coordination, right? You don't even need request anymore, right? So we're broadening out even further. And the covered activities are not just political activities, which it defines as attempting to influence US public opinion on any domestic or foreign policy issue. Exactly what we're doing here today, by the way, right? So this would clearly be kind of covered as political activities under the Act. But it has a whole range of other, soliciting or distributing anything of value, right? And so as a result, the exemptions become really important. There's an exemption for commercial activity. Otherwise, all transnational trade would probably be covered under the Act, right? And so it's really interesting when it's looking at, okay, what do we want to basically be able to cast in this net so that we can use discretionary enforcement to go after activity we don't like, which is exactly what they were trying to do in World War II, which is exactly what they were trying to do in the McCarthy era, and arguably what they're trying to do today. When I talk to legislators on the Hill, you know, well, they're like, we don't need to reform FARA because it's used in a discretionary manner, right, against people we know we want it to be used against, right? That's the way the Act is used today, right, 2024. And so, but it's not the fine arts, it's not Amnesty International, right? It's not the symphony orchestra, right? That's not what we're really trying to capture here. But if there's controversial speech, okay. And we're seeing in our political environment now how that plays out. Yeah, so.
Great, thank you. So I want to turn to TikTok and to the TikTok ban. We've talked about this earlier today, so I'm going to try to approach it a little differently. I'll start out by saying that at least on the reading of Lamont and associated cases that we've heard here, there's some very strong arguments that the First Amendment would not allow a complete ban on a platform like TikTok. There are also arguments often made in the national security side of the equation that, yes, the First Amendment presents a high bar to government regulation, but in this case it is met. This is a severe national security threat. This is a foreign-owned platform that we know to run influence operations. And so, you know, at times it seems that the two sides in this debate each think the other is just completely mad for their position. Like, how can you possibly want to ban an entire communications platform? How can you possibly not ban this platform in particular? So I'm thinking, how should First Amendment advocates respond to these arguments? And in particular, I'm remembering something that came up in a conversation I once had with a staffer on Capitol Hill who was like, you First Amendment people love to tell us what we can't do, but it would be really great if you could tell us what we can do. So I'm going to ask you to just offer your thoughts, either more broadly for why we should continue to allow access to TikTok, but also like what regulations do you like? What do you think would be compatible with the First Amendment and be effective at achieving mitigation of the harms that we're worried about?
Okay, firstly, if I can start with getting very abstract about this, because I did a deep dive into how people think about risk in my previous paper. It's interesting to me because I was looking for good reasons in whatever unredacted material has been shared to argue that you should ban TikTok. You have to see what the counterpoint is. And honestly, I found nothing beyond it is possible that someday the Chinese government may weaponize this app to manipulate the American people, and it's best not to let it get there. Which to me is basically risk thinking, that there is a set of people who are hyper-focused on the idea that this might happen, And because those particular people wield enough power to sort of flag that as a risk that we should all render salient, they've decided that that is the risk, and it is a bigger risk. It basically eclipses the threat to foreign discourse, which the threat to public discourse, which they're not focusing on at all, right? And so this is Dan Kahan's cultural cognition theory, is that when people are making decisions about the law, it is influenced by what they see as salient. So I think that that's partly what's going on. But if I were to respond to them, I would say that there has to be, it's important to establish a threshold of proof. At what stage do you say that this is categorically harmful? How do you identify when something is risky enough to compromise public discourse? I just feel that they haven't engaged with it. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for.
So I guess where I'll start is to say, is to acknowledge that there are real concerns about TikTok's data collection and data privacy practices, as there are with many or most of the online platforms that we use on a day-to-day basis. And the way to address concerns like that are not to ban an entire platform, but to pass comprehensive privacy legislation. I also want to acknowledge that there are potentially real concerns with foreign actors manipulating US citizens, as again, there are with domestic platforms and others who are seeking to manipulate US citizens. Well, I think the question is, who gets to decide what is too dangerous for American citizens to consume, and should it be the government? And as an illustration with Lamont, the Peking Review issue there, I took a look at it, and it includes things like a letter from the Communist Party of the USSR to the Communist Party of China expressing its values. It includes tips on farming and irrigation. It includes critiques of US imperialism and capitalism, which, if that counts as communist political propaganda, I think much of our symposium today probably also counts as communist political propaganda. And the question is, does the government get to decide what Americans hear of that? And with TikTok in particular, I guess why I think a listener's rights perspective is particularly useful here is that it focuses us in on the key interests at stake, right? So the key interest at stake with a TikTok ban is not the interest of ByteDance or the Chinese government to speak. It's not even necessarily of TikTok US, the platform to speak. But the key interests at stake are those of TikTok's users, and I think this listener's rights perspective really helps us hone in on what the real sort of free speech and First Amendment stakes are in this.
Nick?
Yeah, sure. I'll come at this again from a fair angle, since that's why I'm here. But last year, House Oversight Committee said they would start exercising oversight over enforcement of FARA, and two of the examples that they used about why they needed to exercise enforcement was because TikTok had not registered yet as a foreign agent, and the Justice Department had not required them, and Al Jazeera had not, right? Those were the two examples that were being used. And I think what we see often with this concern about foreign influence, and this isn't just in the US, like we work around the world on these foreign influence registration laws that have popped up, often modeled on FARA in the United States, is there's genuine legitimate concerns about foreign influence. And legislators say, we have to do something, this is something, right? It's the old legislative adage, I think it came from like, yes, Prime Minister, right? We have to do something, this is something, right? Here's a bill, it will ban TikTok, here's FARA, let's enforce it against this, let's create a FARA-like law in our country to combat. And I'd say, I think, as you're suggesting, we need a much more kind of problem-oriented approach, right? We've heard about transnational repression. What are the tools we can use to combat transnational repression? In Australia, for example, one of the concerns was about foreign influence in universities. They enacted a foreign influence transparency scheme there. And it really didn't have an effect, right, on pushing back on like concerning kinds of foreign influence they were concerned about, particularly with China. But universities came together and created a risk-based approach, right, on the risks they were seeing, implemented that through guidelines that were enforced across universities, and that had much better of effect, right? And I think it's about having these kinds of targeted solutions that are responsive and proportionate to the actual problem. And unfortunately, I think as soon as you bring up foreign, right, it triggers something in this deep part of the mind of like, oh, we got to do something. Like, this is scary. Something scary is happening. We have to do something. This is something. And I hate to like boil it so simply, but I think in legislators' minds, often that's what's going on.
Can I add a tiny thing to that? I don't know if you noticed that this legislation, it uses the term foreign adversary for a set of states that were previously described as non-allied nations, I think in part to trigger the thing you were talking about.
Okay, we have a question at the mic, I think, and then I'm going to bring in a few from the online QR code.
I have a question about something that I haven't heard discussed at all, and this is the asymmetry that is inherent in discourse with people like from China or Iran, or it was mentioned before in the previous panel from Lebanon, which I presume meant that they've invited members of Hezbollah. And the asymmetry is this, that here in America, if you change your mind, if a Chinese participant convinces you that communism is this great thing, and I now go around and say, oh, communism is wonderful. Now, I'm not going to do it because I'm an ex-Soviet and I am completely immune to that. You know, it was inoculated there. But for the sake of the argument, nothing's going to happen to me. But the Chinese professor or whoever, he cannot get convinced that communism is a pile of garbage, because if he gets convinced and goes in China and says, oh, you know what, whatever President Xi says is garbage, you know, we've got to do it completely different, he's going to wind up in prison at best. And, you know, there are countries where apostasy is a capital offense. I think Pakistan is one of them. And so we have a situation where the opponents are pushing their way of thinking on us, but there is no way for us to push back and to convince them. So it's not an honest conversation. And conversation, again, is about changing the opposite person's mind, and this becomes impossible. And I'm just curious whether that dynamic is being discussed and is being the part of government's rationale or anybody's rationale, because what I'm hearing is, you know, we are supposed to hear and absorb, but we're not supposed to push back and say, you know, what you're saying is really a pile of garbage and you should really change your ways and your mind.
So I think you have illustrated really well this point that when a government declares ideas as sort of unpatriotic and dangerous, these are tactics that we ordinarily associate with authoritarian regimes and not with democracies. And so when the US engages in similar kinds of behavior, it not only looks hypocritical, as I think Anna mentioned on a panel earlier, it really erodes the US's ability to make these points on a more global stage. And a way to illustrate this is, you know, in the Lamont context with communist mail restrictions, that earlier administrative program that was ended by President Kennedy in '61, it was ended in part because he received this report from a committee of the National Security Council, and it said, well, our efforts to intercept and detain communist mail, there's actually no indication that there's any national security benefit that we're gaining from this. And in fact, there are potentially national security risks because of all the work that we're trying to do, talking about the free flow of ideas globally, and that it seems awfully bad to have a program at home that is entirely intended to restrict foreign ideas from coming in when we're trying to make the exact opposite point abroad. And so I think, you know, when the US tries to mirror those tactics, that's when we should really be most critical of our government. And I think, you know, that's what you have with something like the TikTok ban as well.
Go ahead. Okay.
I'll just add another historical example of this, that there is an instrumental argument for the US to live up to its own ideology around exchange of free ideas, and that's not just sort of rhetoric, that if you really believe in it, then the consequence should be that we trust that our ideas will win out in this exchange, even if there is any kind of pushback at the other end. And so you want to maximize the channels for exposure. And one of the places you can see the US defensiveness around something like an ideological agent coming into the US really having consequences was in 1948 there was a Freedom of Information Conference at the United Nations. One of the things that it produced was the text of Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights, from which we got the title Regardless of Frontiers. It's the only conference of the early United Nations on a particular substantive issue. The signature US policy at that conference was going to be a binding multilateral treaty to allow for the free movement of journalists across national borders in the 1940s. And this is what they sort of take to the United Nations and they want to get it signed onto. And there's some support for it. It was going to be an uphill battle. But then the Soviet bloc says, you say that though it will exempt any national laws about excluding journalists for national security grounds. What they were saying was the US is not going to let communist journalists in. Why should we all sign up to this to let American journalists freely report from our country? And so you only actually get that kind of exchange agreement with the Helsinki Accords of '77, right, which then leads to kind of more exchange, which plays a role in helping the fall of the Soviet bloc. And in '94, when Congress passes the Free Trade in Ideas Act to try to close down a lot of these regulations, the argument is made that where we've done exchanges, we now no longer face communist adversaries. Where we have left them in place, particularly Cuba and Iran, those regimes have not toppled. So if what we really want to do is kind of spread the American way of life and liberal democracy, there's an instrumental reason for actually allowing exchange, not just a kind of idealistic one.
Yeah, so following up on this point, many thoughts, so appreciate it. I'll first pick up on this, which is, one of our publications that gets most read at our organization is this publication called Pharaoh's Double Life Abroad. And it's because all these authoritarian governments have picked up on FARA. I think this has been the most devastating impact of FARA for the cause of democracy globally. This has included Russia, Hungary, Kyrgyzstan, Nicaragua, Georgia, right? Other places, and said, well, you have the Foreign Agent Registration Act. We're going to enact this. And they do, and you can't say anything, right? Because you have this law. And then we're gonna go after, and we're gonna shut down civil society. All the voices we don't like, anybody, right? We're gonna shut them down using this. And as I said, it's a really expansive act, right? You can imagine how this could happen. So there's those countries. And then there's the kind of more established democracies that have all enacted these in recent years, or many of them have. And there's a big debate in the EU about this right now, but France, the UK, Canada, and Australia have all in the last 3 or 4 years enacted a much narrower version of FARA. And the big debate amongst the democracies, including in the US now, is this question you're bringing up, right? Should this we're not really worried about interactions between the UK and the US, or Canada and the US. So should we set this up and just have it be targeting China and just be targeting Russia? So the UK had theirs apply to everyone, but they create this enhanced category that the government can choose certain countries of concern to put in that enhanced category, and there'll then be more registration requirements. Canada was just debating that. They rejected it. Partly out of concerns about the model for the world, partly because of concerns about like stigmatization that will have for like the Chinese Canadian community. There'll be like good Chinese Canadians and bad Chinese Canadians, right? And what are the implications for that? Also, all the politics of choosing, like we'd put China in it, but would they put India? Like India just killed somebody in Canada. Seems like they should put India in that category, but there's like a lot of geopolitical reasons about whether you put that country in the category or not. So they ultimately rejected it, but on the Hill in Congress, a lot of the FARA proposals right now for amendments of changing it are creating countries of concern that explicitly list out Russia, China, and Iran, right, to have different registration requirements that are there. And I think this is a real issue that the civil liberties community is going to have to grapple with, right? Because it's very popular globally. Australia is re-looking at their act with this in mind, right? And so I think we're going to have to think about it because it's coming, and what's the response to that, right?
I could not agree more. It's interesting to me because to go back to what George said in the beginning, the nature of a democracy is to prioritize what its citizens want and their ability to participate fully. And for that, they need access to all information. And it's partly that, but it's also partly that when citizens are told that they will be deprived of access to information, they feel disrespected. And that's part of like the sociological legitimacy of a democracy. I can say that because I'm from a different eroding democracy. India is contemplating banning Wikipedia. Because they want High Court wants Wikipedia to remove a page. And it illustrates the point here that if the US were to make laws like this, it would make it easier for other countries to say that we're banning Wikipedia. That's a part of it. But the second is that you can't claim to be a democracy and then use reasons like foreign policy. So we're more concerned about competing with the Chinese than we are with respecting our own citizens in a democracy. I think that that's a difficult argument to make.
Great answers, thank you. One thing that struck me, particularly in the historical papers, is this sort of recurring back and forth between some really good, really strong, I think, inspiring rhetoric that Americans can take it. They can face these ideas that do not comport with our way of life, and they can make their own decisions and see why ours is better. Coupled with this really deep-seated fear, that, like, what if that's not true? And I think, if anything, that's only gotten worse over the years in terms of the way our appeals to the marketplace of ideas, coupled with our clear doubt that the marketplace of ideas is actually going to function for us here. Okay, so I'm going to try to take a couple of the questions that came in online. One question is, if the TikTok ban takes effect, how long would it take for it to be struck down on First Amendment grounds? Would that be immediate? So first of all, I love your optimism. I'm wondering if anyone, so I should back up and just say, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is a law that was passed by Congress and signed by Joe Biden requiring TikTok to divest from its parent company, which is ByteDance, based in China, within, I think they gave them a year or 9 months, or be banned in the United States. So would anyone like to talk to the way courts have looked at restrictions on TikTok so far, or how we think they would should this ban come into effect?
Sure, I guess I can speak to this a little bit. I mean, so I'm also very interested in hearing the answer to this question. Both interested to hear when it's going to get struck down on First Amendment grounds, and also when it's going to happen. So there is currently litigation going on in the DC Circuit on the federal ban, which oral argument was last month, I think, early last month. They granted expedited review, so I think we should really be expecting a decision any time now, and I didn't bring my phone with me, so I imagine if there was a decision, people in this room would have gotten up and left, so I think we're safe there. But we should be expecting that anytime soon, and I think in all likelihood, whatever the DC Circuit decides, I'm terrible at reading the tea leaves when it comes to courts, but I think it's very likely that the Supreme Court will review it. There's also litigation in the Ninth Circuit regarding Montana's ban. But I think it is I guess one important note here is that there has only been one federal court to have addressed these broad TikTok bans, and that is the district court on the Montana ban, and the district court there concluded that there were serious First Amendment problems, and I think we should take that seriously, right? Again, who knows what's going to happen at the DC Circuit or any other place, but I think we should take seriously that the first court to really consider these issues saw these problems.
Anyone else? Maybe. Okay.
No, I mean, I do want to say that the WeChat case had an outcome that makes me optimistic, which is that ban was struck down, but this is different, and I want to leave it to people who are actual lawyers in the US.
Okay, so I think this will probably be our last question. And I'm going to combine something that someone submitted online and a question of my own, which is, does it matter, should it matter, that a listener knows who is speaking to them? There is, on the one hand, a long tradition of protection for anonymous speech in the United States under the First Amendment. On the other hand, a lot of the concerns that are being raised about platforms like TikTok and about online disinformation campaigns more broadly is that you don't know who is behind them, that the average listener, recipient, or end user is not aware of who is actually the speaker or who designed that content. How should we think about that? Is there a way to address those concerns without infringing on First Amendment rights?
I can outline, so again, with the caveat that I don't use TikTok. So back when misinformation was sort of the key problem that everyone was thinking of, Martha Minow wrote a piece saying that if there are foreign actors spreading any kind of electoral information, then people have a right to know. I wouldn't say that so I'm on the fence about it. I think that if we accept that we exist as listeners in a marketplace of ideas, and the model that we're working on is that we evaluate ideas and accept the one that we consider best, then that wouldn't work. But I do want to acknowledge that actually the way it does work is that we trust some groups of people more than we trust other groups of people. And so I would be concerned if a group was masquerading as a different group that you might trust. I think that that is cause for concern, and I think that that is why platforms like Facebook make an attempt to try and filter out coordinated efforts to manipulate communication. But I think that's very different from one-off efforts. That's very different from an anonymous account saying Black Lives Matter, if that makes sense. Not fully formed, I'm still thinking it through.
This is tangential, but can go in. But I think another way of thinking about this is also about what kind of speech, obviously. And I think one useful rubric is kind of thinking about what is this kind of core political speech and core like democratic decision making around electioneering, around lobbying, right? Where we will accept a higher level of transparency, which is a different kind of surveillance, right? Like if you think about it in certain kinds of interactions. Because we want to be able to see where this is coming from, who's talking to our legislators, who's testifying before Congress, right? You have to disclose all sorts of things if you testify before Congress, versus the public square, right? And I think we just need to keep coming back to those distinctions because unfortunately what we've seen in things like FARA, right, is using the same regulatory tool for both, which I think is madness. Right? I think a lot of people think of FARA as a transparency tool for lobbyists of foreign governments. It actually might be an okay tool for that, right? It's not a good tool for the public square, right? It's a terrible tool for that. And so I think we have to keep on going back. What's the problem we're trying to orient? What's the rights at stake? How are we weighing that? So that's my 2 cents there.
So I think the only thing I'll add quickly to this is, I think these ideas have kind of, I think each of us on this panel have expressed some version of this, but I think one way to think about listeners' rights is as a structural right? That it's not, about listening to any particular piece of speech or information, but that it's protecting our ability to access, the structure of communication that informs our ideas about how to participate in our democracy and with one another. And I think thinking about listeners' rights in this structural way, breathes a little bit more meaning into what it means to be a listener, and also what the First Amendment means. And I think that's especially true in the digital age, where there's information all over the place, and it comes from all sorts of different sources. And I think there's real reason to think that as we are in the digital age, we should be thinking about these listeners' rights in this more structural way, and also maybe a more cosmopolitan way.
Great. Well, we have reached the close of this panel as well as the close of this event. So I want to thank all of our panelists, both up here and all of the speakers throughout the day. The conversations were really fantastic. And thank you to the audience for being here and for watching online. I hope we gave you something new to think about. I hope you'll sign up for our newsletter. We'd love to see you at a future event. Have a good afternoon, everyone.